Be nice for me if I could tell the stories of what makes my life feel meaningful, and people would want to hear because because they're interested. But I don't have that kind of delusion to think that that's the case. When I go to the People page in the Week magazine, if it's something about somebody I know a bunch about who've been sort of present in my mind for a while, celebrities, Denzel Washington, what's happened with him, some story about and Audrey Hepburn, I'd be interested in that. But if it's somebody I've never even heard of who's got some, if it's interesting and intrinsically, like it would happen to some John Doe, okay, I might want to read it. But what do I care about some singer that I don't even know that I ever heard any of the music and the name doesn't seem familiar? So I'm here as a guy who claims to have an integrative story that puts some things in an importantly different light. But I don't think that there's a lot of folks who, having heard signs of there might be something there, uh, have registered. Well, how did a guy like that get to be a guy like that? But the real reason I'm making this video, though I hope there are a few people who would actually find that question interesting, is basically, well, I think I'm an old guy. And one of the things that old guys do is they look back on their life to see how it unfolded and to create a meaningful whole out of it, a story that makes sense, um, that one can embrace as this was and has been, and if one's lucky, still is, what my life has been about. And this is the adventure that I went on in the pursuit of what it was I was pursuing. So, in that spirit, I feel like sharing um, something that was gratifying to me a few minutes ago when I first started sort of looking at the thing, um, and seeing that there was some excitement along the path that maybe somebody would find interesting to think about. Go back to when I was a junior in college. Um, it seems like it was at that point that I sort of dedicated myself to seeing things in a way that was really meaningful. As I wanted to see things whole. I felt like things are connected with other things, and we should put the pieces together. I want to say more about that probably as I go on. And the other thing is to go deep into the reality till you get to some place that one experiences as things as meaningful, like emotional, uh, spiritual. So I started turning as a junior in college as a major in what was called social relations at Harvard. Um, I started turning to more and more interdisciplinary things. Um, Actually, my sophomore year, I got into a tutorial for looking at sort of good social thought of a variety of kinds, but if it was called social studies. It was okay. But when I was a junior, I I started looking into how do you understand the deep human reality that's behind the patterns and symbols that you see being expressed in a culture, like their literary productions or the way they conceive their religious world, um, or the symbols at work in their politics. I looked into all those things and employed a mixture of things in which the main ingredients was um, the interpretation of symbols as brilliantly pioneered by Freud and uh, done in a somewhat different way but also seeming to penetrate some important human realities by Carl Gustav Jung in Switzerland, finding out that the two of them fought because Jung wouldn't hew to the Freud's orthodox lines. Uh, just so hard to get the human world to work well. But anyway, that was one of my interests, and I did things about movements on the radical right and interpreting, what's going on in the minds and in the society that produces people who think rock and roll is a communist Russian plot against to turn America's youth into their animal impulses or something like that. Well, what does it mean when that kind of thing arises? But as a junior, I was in a graduate seminar led by Robert Bellah, who was the preeminent sociologist of religion, I think, he said, in that era, which is to say, we're like 1965 or six probably, and it was a chance that I jumped onto with both feet. Everybody got a turn as the semester went along, presenting their ideas about something having to do with sociology of religion. And then the whole seminar, the graduate seminar, I was the only undergraduate in there, would discuss those ideas. And maybe because I was a mere Ute, I came later in the session. And I just threw myself into it, and I ended up writing a 150-page piece called Maternal Religion and Paternal Religion. It made use of some anthropology, or what appeared at the time to be good anthropology, made use of some work of Bettelheim, it made use of some Freudian thinking, and it made use of some of the theories of how human civilization had evolved through stages and stuff like that. And I just, put together the fragments of understanding that I had developed by this point. And I'm probably 18 years old at this point. And I wrote 150 pages. It was a terrible night getting copies mimeographed, if you remember that word. I didn't even go to bed that night to get enough copies of 150 pages mimeographed and stapled and ready to give to everybody. This was the week before mine would be discussed. This was the deadline for me to distribute it. And then the following year, oh, by the way, I don't even look at that anymore. I feel kind of proud of what I think I did, but at the same time, I think I was kind of clueless too, that I hadn't really sorted through what pieces to be should be taken seriously and given a large role in the picture, and what other forces there might be at play. But I took it a step further the next year when, as a senior, my senior thesis, I chose to do something about the meaning of heroic tragedy. I was just drawn. Tragedy is the deep thing. I mean, Shakespeare and the Athenians. I mean, this is literature that the world just sort of redounds to still. Hamlet and Oedipus Rex, and it's just the creation of worlds that people are just vibrating to at such a deep level. There must be a lot of meaningfulness there, and in my thirst for meaningfulness, I went after tragedy, and I spent the summer between my junior and senior years reading what I could get my hands on about tragedy, also learning at least enough Greek so that when I read things about tragedy, I would be able to at least read the alphabet and know some of the key words that are related to tragedy. And I also worked to, I asked two basic questions for my dissertation that emerged out of my thinking that summer. One was, what are the psychological issues that are being dealt with in these plays, whether it's Aeschylus and Sophocles or Shakespeare and Marlowe in Elizabethan England? Um, what are they dealing with that make them all tragedies? And why is that pattern of things that's called tragedy? Not that it hews to just one thing, but it is a meaningful category. What are the psychological issues that are being dealt with that people find it meaningful to keep watching Hamlet from generation to generation, etc.? Um, and why is it that tragedy emerged at that particular place and time? Those places and times, because tragedy really flowered for the most part just in those two eras, Athenian Greece and Elizabethan England. Why? Why then? What was going on in the societies that made dealing with these issues in those ways meaningful? And I came up with, well, something that Professor Bella, the fellow I mentioned about the graduate, he thought it was worthy of publication. And he became its champion when they decided, um, well, I want to avoid something, but anyway, it got honored. Um, but I never look at it. It's up there in the tool shed in a box, uh, and I would love it if somebody someday wanted to know, well, what was Schmuckler able to do about seeing things whole back when he was 20 and working within this framework of anthropology and history and psychology. Um, that's the way I've thought. And if you think that that's grandiose, well, I've always had in mind that somehow I was going to earn myself a place in history, and that's simply true. But at at this moment, I do believe that what I've put together actually should, but leave that issue aside. So when I came time to graduate and to choose what I was going to do next, I really wasn't clear about where I was going. Um, I felt that the choice I was going to make was going to set me on a path that was probably going to be carrying me along, um, and probably would not be really simple as I understood progress through life to correct. So I really tried to, and I ended up with two choices that I couldn't decide between. One was to become a clinical psychologist and to deal with people, uh, to help excavate the levels of meaning by seeing the patterns in their and the connections in their life, and being able to work through by being able to see clearly what the issues were. That's how I imagined it, and I couldn't give up that fantasy that I could do that, because I had been doing that with not with people, coming into my office, but with cultural manifestations and pieces of literature, interpreting symbols. Um, I loved it. And I felt that at that level, a sort of Joseph Campbell being interviewed by Bill Moyer's level, the idea that the mythopoetic level of our experience of meaning is a very profound entree into something that we really should attend to. There's a spiritual quality to it, and that's always been important to me. But I ultimately saw that the spiritual dimension in a larger context in which the challenges we face uh, need to be looked at more clearly. Uh, that a lot of the stuff that's going on in terms of our psychological structure has to do with things that have gone wrong in the unfolding of forces in the human world, and the way we get broken by that. So the assignment then gets to be, well, how do you make the world more whole? And even though it's important to understand, well, what is being enacted here? Like, for example, what gets enacted between Donald Trump and major parts of his base is probably best understood in some kind of psychological wedded with sociological ways. That there is something that has happened psychologically that between leader and the led that makes certain things possible that Freud, maybe Jung, and other, just the general idea of a depth psychology is quite relevant. But then that's actually more derivative of the larger level that I eventually got to. But to resume the story, so what I did was I refused to make a decision because I didn't come to a decision. And I went to the University of Chicago to pursue my doctorate. It was going to be 2 doctorates I was going to be pursuing at the same time. One was going to be in clinical psychology, and University of Chicago had a rather good clinical psychology program. I think of a guy named Eugene Gendlin was really a fine part of that program that I got to study with. And he went on to do some worthwhile things about making things whole. But I also was admitted to be a graduate student in the Committee on Social Thought. I thought that the Committee on Social Thought was a place where people were going to be working on seeing things whole, because that's what I had tried to do with this tragedy thing that I wrote. And that was what I was trying to do the year before with the maternal religion and paternal religion. A bit sophomoric in some ways, a bit pedestrian, like a student has to be in some ways, but on the track of seeing that, in fact, there are ways in which the psychological level and the social evolutionary level are interacting and creating meaningful macro patterns and creating meaningful micro patterns in the experiential realm, like people sitting in an Athens theater and watching tragedies. 300 and whatever BC. So I went to the Committee on Social Thought, and they had some good people there. But it really wasn't much seeing things whole. I mean, it seemed to offer that since they were claiming for themselves the right to cultivate their own idiosyncratic or their own piece of the thing, whether it be like some study of the history of Near Eastern philosophy, or whether it was Saul Bellow, for example, talking in a bored way with 2 graduate students about the spirit of comedy, in which his book, Henderson the Rain King, was one of a whole bunch that this little group of 4 graduate students read together. And they had Bruno Bettelheim, that I had made use of before, who I'd studied, who seemed like such a splendid guy, so full of heart and empathy for the downtrodden. And then I took his graduate course, which was a lecture course, and found out that when he ran this course, he behaved sort of like a Gestapo guy in a World War II movie. He was a bully. He challenged and, where possible, humiliated people. It's really shocking to psychologically try to put together the guy who had written these books about the way it's men envying women and not women envying men, and the guy who interprets these fairy tales in such a deep, empathetic way, and a guy who deals with autism in a way that, well, it's rather hard on the mothers, but it's full of empathy for the poor kid. Well, there he was. My mom had always instilled in me that you don't let bullies bully people. So I stood up to him a few times in this big lecture class, 150 people or so, and and complained about how he was treating some of the people who had dared to speak or that he had called upon. And it seemed like he liked me for doing that, but it was still troubling. But he sort of was in himself a kind of clue to a kind of human complexity. You know, like I can find in the world around me now, where I live in a place where I see some people that I can see as genuinely good people, but I can see them aligning themselves with something which I can really do a very persuasive job of showing is reasonably understood as a force of evil. People are just very complicated, and that's the depth psychology aspect of it, but it's also important to understand how people get broken, and that's the systemic forces aspect of it. Anyway, I left Chicago because my life was just coming up against an iceberg. Some of them having to do with the politics of that era. Um, I was getting a draft notice, and the Tet Offensive was occurring, and the assassinations were happening, and the Chicago Convention, and all that. And it piled on personal stuff, like having to do with the death of my father, and who knows how it could have been if this had been different or that had been different. But I dropped out for the first time. I wasn't charging ahead in my ambitious way. I just dropped out, and I became a political actor trying to help end the Vietnam War through the 1968 presidential election. And I dropped out because the world was showing itself to be so broken that I no longer could imagine. I was just going to become a clinical psychologist or like a member of some faculty like the Committee on Social Thought, doing my thing like they're doing their thing. If the world's out of joint, then I'd be out of joint for just fitting in that way. So I dropped out and asked, why is the world so screwed up? And what can I do that's not just being part of what's screwed up? And then the answer came to me, um, and over the years continued to unfold. This was the first book that an experience that 3 years after graduating from college and then going to Chicago and then dropping out and sort of wandering, being lost, pretty lost, and not having no idea where I was going in my life, to then getting an idea of, well, here is actually some important way of seeing not the whole thing whole, but a lot of it, and a lot that puts things into an importantly different light. And then continuing, and this takes the idea from there. Here in the parable of the tribes, I describe the destructive force that inevitably emerges if any species takes a step onto the path of civilization. To look at that moment in an evolutionary perspective is to understand that creature, what that creature is doing, the path of civilization, what it means, is that these are societies that are created by a creature that for the first time in a 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth has extricated itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by creating its own way of life. And a way of life that's been created out of the creative intelligence of the creature is a whole different kind of life form. Huge repercussions. People haven't looked at it enough. That's what hit me in 1970. Boy, there's a big deal here. And I haven't seen anything refuted. It got out there. I haven't seen any counter arguments. And then once you unleash that into the world, if you want to see things whole, and you go to that again, first of all, it's got to do with sort of the idea that it may be an exaggeration to say everything's connected with everything. But there are so many organic interconnections that run through the world, through the network of cause and effect. There are so many interconnections that everything being connected with everything should at least get you to look at, well, what are the connections here? And so that's been a habit of mine, back to when I was 18. The second important principle, not only is everything connected with everything, but if one thing is true and another thing is true, then the picture of the world that you should be seeking is one in which both of those can be true, whether they're connected or not. But if they seem to contradict each other, well, if they're both true, then ultimately they don't contradict each other. So the way I put this in the 1990s was, if this is true and that is true, and they appear to contradict each other, where is the higher wisdom? Where we see things whole enough that we can see the truth of this, and we can see the truth of that, and we can see how they should be combined to make a more whole human world. No, that was yet another book that I wrote. Let's see. Yeah, let me. So I spent the 1990s actually trying to seek that higher wisdom. I did radio work in a conservative area in Virginia on an audience that was a lot of whom were well marinated on Rush Limbaugh 3 hours a day, and creating conversations in which we would talk with each other in a spirit of genuine inquiry. This was the value that I was pursuing at that time, was that the conservatives had some valid points to be made that whose validity shouldn't be denied on the other side, and vice versa. And yet in our polarizing society, that was what was happening. So I took my seeing things whole mission onto the radio. But then the kind of conversation that we had for the better part of a decade, when I was sort of on talk radio here in the most powerful station, AM station in Shenandoah Valley, talking with conservatives about the questions of meaning and value that we face in our lives, some of which were matters over which we disagreed as a liberal and as conservatives. But we created a community of discourse that pursued that. And then I created, out of my lying in bed, thinking about all the conversations. Oh, what did I do? I'm sorry. Well, anyway, I wrote a book called Debating the Good Society, a title I hate. And it consists of dialogue of people who have pieces of the truth. And here's that book, Debating the Good Society, A Quest to Bridge America's Moral Divide. Seeing things whole in a way in which all the various pieces of the truth are recognized. Oh, golly. Then seeing things whole changed. The community of discourse that I was able to create in the 1990s, where we actually did talk to each other in a spirit of mutual respect, and actually we're working to see if we can find ways of creating a conversation on the air that would be heard by, well, what, a few thousand people at least, and it would have a healing effect, however trivial. But to move people's minds from the polarized, angry, dogmatic, into a spirit of working together to create a better America, to find the higher wisdom in which all the pieces of the truth are seen to be compatible, because everything that's true has got to be fundamentally compatible with everything else that's true. Seeing things whole. Then what became clear was that a drama was getting played out in the American power system. A force was emerging, a coherent force that was consistently working to make the human world more broken. It was emerging, starting, as far as my perception was concerned, starting with the 1990s, and the way the Republicans under Newton and on the radio Limbaugh were dealing with a duly elected Democratic president, as if he were not legitimate in the office. And then gathering force so that the Bush administration and the conduct of the Republicans when Obama was president were both unprecedented in a lot of very important and visible ways. And if you're seeing things whole, you see in the 1990s that the American mind is getting poisoned. And then you can see under W that there is a force that's rising that, as a really fine speech from a Unitarian minister in Dallas, if I recall, in 2004, said, look at this. There is a pattern here. It is overlaps considerably with what has been a recognizable force we call fascism. That was the W administration. And then look at the unprecedented ways that the Republicans had behaved over, our national decision about health care, which they couldn't accept, that they'd lost the political battle, that they couldn't really accept that their opponent had succeeded. There wasn't anything particularly contrary to any interest of theirs that Obama failed, I don't think. But the idea that he should succeed and that the people should perceive that there is a place for a government that's trying to serve the people's needs and solve national problems, they repealed it. It wasn't 100 times, but, between 50 and 100 times, was it? And trying to obstruct him at every turn. That is not a legitimate strategy. But seeing things whole, you would see that there was that pattern. And I, being in the habit of seeing things whole, saw that there was something had taken over the Republican Party that needed to be seen for what it was, denounced for what it was, and defeated for what it was. But we're back in liberal America, where seeing things whole hasn't been a habit. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of effort to see things whole. But it's definitely not easy to see things whole. A lot of the efforts that you see emerging out of history end up not standing up as well as people had sometimes thought. Freud and Marx, for example. I've noticed that whenever there has been an effort to create a department or something where seeing things whole was a collective effort, I don't think I've ever seen it. There was a Committee on Social Thought where Saul Bellow teaches a course where we read Felix Krull, Confidence Man by Thomas Mann, and talk about it. Is in the same thing where somebody else is reading some kind of archaeological treatise or something. I don't even remember what. There are people, good people in that. But like I mentioned, Bettelheim. There's Redfield Senior and Redfield Junior on that faculty. I mean, interesting work, but there wasn't anything coherent about the field. And later, when I was trying to find a place in academia, which is not organized for seeing things whole, on the contrary, in order for me to write that book, which I did, no, not that one. In order for me to write this book, I had to fight academia at Yale and then at Berkeley and end up with a degree that turned out to disqualify me for any job as a chairman of the sociology department at Princeton once told me. If you want to see that story told, it's kind of interesting. Go to my YouTube channel and do a word search with Princeton. He told me something about how academia works. And what it doesn't work to do is to see things whole. But the one place where I actually looked like I might be getting a foot in the door at one point was at UC Santa Cruz. Beautiful place on one of the loveliest parts of the planet, and a very groovy institution with redwood trees all over it. University of California, Santa Cruz had a program called History of Consciousness. And, well, I didn't get that position because when it was about to maybe happen, there was a budget thing at the University of California level, which just, killed everything right on the spot. But I noticed when I looked at what they were doing too, that it was there wasn't any sense of a collective effort, which is humbling because I think that what it shows is that seeing things whole in a meaningful way is really not easy. You can have a little piece of something where you make some connections over here, and that stretches the mind some to see those connections. And then you could have this other thing, which is talking about something which is, you can't see there's any relationship between them. But if you got those people together and you said, well, what does it all add up to? I don't know that I've seen that any group has been able to come up with something. Now, there's an outfit that I don't fully understand that I've been exposed to here and there over the years called the Santa Fe Institute. And I don't have a clear enough idea. Some people have thought that they should be taking me in. But I've looked at their work and I'm not sure that they should. And I'm not sure what they're building. But in any event, I haven't seen much putting things together to see things whole. I got involved with an institute called the Institute for Noetic Sciences. It was founded by, I think, Willis Harman, who's a sort of visionary, somewhat spiritual intellectual leader. I don't really know enough how much to recognize there, but I had a good feeling about it. And there was an astronaut, one of the ones that had the spiritual experience from looking at the blue marble from outer space. But their way of putting things together was, I think, so wedded to the spiritual that it didn't do very much to illuminate the nature of the systemic forces that are at work determining the destiny of the human world. And according to me, that really is the word, how these forces get formed and unleashed is the heart of the story. There are a lot of things going on, but the foundation of what's going on has to do with the unprecedented step that we took, the fateful step that we took, not reflecting human nature any more than it has to, in order to say we had the creative intelligence that we were able to change the rules, that we could take the food that the women used to gather and we could turn them into crops that we controlled better. And we could take the animals that the men used to hunt and we could turn them into herds that we have better control over. And that transforms the niche in which humankind had emerged over millions of years as primate bands to a whole new situation where culture has actually gotten unleashed, and there's going to be all kinds of innovation, all kinds of cultural options are going to emerge. And whereas when we were in that niche, there was an order that would control the interactions among the actors. The line I keep on saying really should be looked at is that the lion and the zebra and the grass operate together to create a perpetual living whole, even as they devour each other. I used to say create a perpetual motion machine, but somebody pointed out that didn't feel organic enough. And I think they're right. It's not, in a way, life on Earth before civilization was operating pretty much like a well-oiled machine. Most of the disruptions that ever occurred came from outside the living system. But within the living system, there's a continual process of selection that makes sure that the interactions of the lion and the zebra and the grass work together in a synergistic, therefore viable fashion. But when the inventive species, with a brain that's bigger and more capable than any brain that emerged before, even our smarter animal relatives don't seem to have anything that really quite rivals what we can do. Well, we were hoist by our own petard. We were able to change the rules. Those first steps probably seemed like big improvements, but we plunged into an unprecedented situation that had an unprecedented systemic dynamic that led to an inevitable war of all against all, which led to an inevitable selection for those cultural options, and only those cultural options, that are able to survive, prevail in a war of all against all. And that is problematic. And then that book, The Parable of Tribes, is all about that crucial first step. And seeing things whole is to say, okay, if a creature takes that step and inevitably unleashes that force with those consequences, how does that change how we understand this whole human story? Well, it transforms it in really consequential ways. That's what I claim. So I've done it in various ways here, including just now in a capsule. That book is boiled down 1,600 pages for my doctoral dissertation. And then Ford gave me a grant to turn that into a book that could be published. All the people I thought would lap it up at 1,600 pages, like some university presses, I thought it was a big deal. I said, this is too long, we wouldn't consider it. Okay. The idea hit me with such a ton of bricks. I thought, as soon as, wait till they get a load of this, as Jack Nicholson would say. I mean, it just changed my life. I thought it was going to change everything. But, the reputable university presses I was, salivating about taking his thing out, said, no, this is too long. And only the University of California, by the way, this book almost didn't get published. That's a fact. I mean, it was skewed between people who thought, wow, this is a really big deal, and people who thought this shouldn't see the light of day, whatever that means. If we look at the connections, and here we're talking about connections in the realm of cause and effect, you plunge out of an order that life has depended upon, that life has created, because then life can't depend upon it. Life can't control asteroids. It can't control North and South America coming together, creating some chaos. It can't control the coming and going of ice ages, which creates some chaos. But within its own domain, it creates order. And here, this species takes an unprecedented step. Unprecedented means there ain't no order waiting for it. A new situation. This thing that the biosphere is wasn't designed according to science. Nobody said, let's make something really whole and life-serving. That's what happens. But you leave that order, and then something else happens that has to do with disorder. And when you get something in disorder, that disorder, a war of all against all, that's going to have an impact. That's going to become a cause of a whole universe of effects. This creature inevitably, and I say that this would be true of any civilization creating species on any planet that takes that step. It's not about what we are, it's about the nature of the system. That system is going to select for the ways of power. And the ways of power, the selection process is going to be a war of all against all. Lots of brokenness grows out of that all by itself. The cause and effect of transmitting a pattern of brokenness can be traced in looking at the impact of on these traumatized people. And that's why my second book, Out of Weakness, Healing the Wounds That Drive Us to War, talked about how that selection for the ways of power, which I also have come to call the spirit of the gangster, inevitably gives the spirit of the gangster gets a disproportionate say in how the human world will develop. Not because the spirit of the gangster has any special place in terms of the universe of human natures of all the various billions of people. But it turns out that because of the systemic dynamic, you end up with human monsters playing a much bigger role in shaping the human world than their proportion in the human population of what most people are like. I've talked several times about how, in my opinion, if you made a list of the 4 people who are having the biggest impact on the planet in the last couple years, the 4 people I would name, 3 of them would be sociopaths, and 2 of them at least I would consider qualifying as human monsters. Yet I don't run into human monsters and sociopaths, anything like that. 3 out of 4 or half in the human world around me. Systemic dynamics can be used to explain that. And making the connections, seeing things whole, finding the nature of the force that's moving through the human world, and that sometimes can take over an actor, like has happened in the American political system. One of the two major parties in the American political system has become something which would have been considered unthinkable here in the United States, in the America I grew up in. For all the problems that we had with McCarthyism, over the conflict over the Vietnam War, nobody, I don't think, would have imagined as a plausible scenario the picture of America that we can see right now in terms of the threat to the survival of American democracy and the rule of law. I mean, even as recently as a year ago, people who knew a lot about what's going on, people like Andrew Weissman, could not have imagined that a Supreme Court would have handed down the decision they handed down in the immunity case. Weissman was certainly critical of that Supreme Court, but he didn't imagine that the battle has gone so far off. I mean, what he would say is, the decision is the decision. I mean, the decision to delay, is the decision. Meaning they are siding with this guy in this instance to help him defeat the rule of law. But Weissman couldn't imagine that the Supreme Court would take seriously for a minute what Trump was claiming about the rights of the most powerful person in the country to violate the laws of this country, pretty free of fear of any consequences, virtually at will. The SEAL Team 6 thing. He couldn't imagine that, but it turns out that it was worse even than he thought. Seeing things whole. There is a major integrated threat that's arisen in the American power system that has precipitated a showdown in the battle over whether America will be a democracy or become a fascist society. Most people that I consider intelligent observers would say that's not an overstatement. Seeing things whole calls upon us to recognize the nature of the battle and to communicate with the American people, which is our last line of defense here. Whatever it is that can be communicated that will get them to side with democracy, which I'm willing to bet is what most people really would want if they understood what the stakes are. So today, I can see that Weissman understands what this Supreme Court has become. And I'd like for him to use his knowledge more impactfully. I could see him today in the wake of Eileen Cannon, the judge in Florida that's thrown out this documents case on the basis that Jack Smith and his whole special prosecutor status and those rules that have created special prosecutors, they're all unconstitutional, she says. I think that what I could see in Weissman was that he regarded Cannon's argument as being as meritless as the immunity claim was he assumed that the Supreme Court wasn't going to create a role for an American dictator in clear violation of the purpose of the Constitution. He couldn't imagine that, and he turned out to be wrong. And he's taken a second look at the Supreme Court. And today, when I saw him on TV, he was showing how wrong Cannon is in a fairly subtle way, but he was making the case. He was prosecuting the case against her. But he was looking to the Supreme Court without, you could see that he did not trust the Supreme Court to uphold the obvious rule of law. When Trump would have them do something else, when the fascist force that put them on the bench would have them do something else. That maybe they'll come down upholding the idea that Jack Smith has no legitimacy and forcing all those federal cases against the most serious crimes in American history to go away. Because you can't have a special prosecutor. I think a year ago, Weissman would have said, well, it's going to go up to the Supreme Court. It's just going to delay things. But no way this is going to, no. He recognized it. Please, Mr. Weissman, you've done such a wonderful job of showing us so much of the legal landscape. Please show us right now what you see the Supreme Court as having become. And show us in as impactful a way as possible how you feel about this assault on the system of justice that you devoted your entire life to, that you've shown your passion for. So how do you feel? We can see it beneath the surface, but how about you unleash your outrage? If you've got any ideas about how we fight against this thing. Because America cannot afford to acquiesce in a situation where every one of our major conflicts comes to a group of people who have been given the responsibility for applying the Constitution, but are instead applying a partisan interest in determining what's going to happen. And not just any party's partisan interest, but the partisan interest of a basically fascistic force that's threatening the achievement that really lies at the heart of America. I know that Andrew Weissman finds this system of justice that he worked in to be shaped by values he holds sacred, whether he'd use that word or not. But let's hear the voice of righteous outrage. Let's have him help us see this thing for what it is and want to set this, to take the power away from this thing, like we need to do as the American people in this battle between democracy and fascism. Let's see this thing whole. Let's look at that coherent force that put these people on the bench, that has given us a Supreme Court that's willing to side with the criminal against the rule of law under these circumstances. This is part of the task of humankind in dealing with the force of destructiveness that inevitably rose with civilization. This is America's contemporary version of a battle between two coherent forces. I won't go further with that. But we can see things whole. I do believe that it holds water. And while there's room for a lot of other things to be true, this one captures some of the real steel girders that create the structure of our situation. The selection for power, the creation of brokenness in the human psyche and spirit, the transmission of patterns of brokenness and of patterns of wholeness through the human world in the dense network of cause and effect. And the presence within us of things that have been selected for the process of evolution that have been put in us, having a moral dimension to them, having a spiritual dimension to them, having been put into us, which is clear evidence that it must have been beneficial for our ancestors to have those experiential tendencies that have a moral dimension of this is better than that, have a spiritual dimension of experiences having some kind of special quality. But it was put into us by evolution, which is continually choosing what can survive over what is less able to survive. So it means it had survival value, which means it's life-serving. And we have access to those things. So we need to expand the evolutionary view way beyond what the secular worldview has done now. There are implications to it that can now be excavated and flesh out our understanding of how our story on this planet has evolved and the status that the moral and spiritual dimensions should have in our lives. By the way, I'm thinking that the moral and spiritual shallowness of the, maybe emptiness in sometimes of the secular worldview is part of the answer of why fascism has been rising around the world. I haven't thought that through very far, but I'll probably come back and try that out on you. I'm still struggling to understand why it is that fascism, seeing things whole, what's happening in the United States is happening at over the same decades. That something similar has been happening in Turkey, in India, in Israel, in Brazil, in Hungary, for a while in Poland. Well, why has that been happening? Countries that don't seem to, seeing things whole. The pursuit of it has been my obsession. And if you want to see what I have presented as an important piece of how to see things whole, that I think holds water, that has never been in any way refuted. Take a look at my videos here on YouTube. Go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org. My whole purpose here is to get that way of seeing things whole out into the world where I think it could do us some good. And if you know people who might be interested in getting some piece of that or seeing whether the whole thing does hold water, please forward the link to this or any other of my videos. Thank you very much. Thanks.